during the 6th century, okay, we know that this is considered a watershed of theology. Why? The basic background of this particularly happened uh, especially in Western Northern Europe, in Ireland. Okay, this became an important watershed of theology, especially because of the growth of the monastic tradition. Remember, monasticism, of course, had its tradition even before Christ. Okay, but especially after Christianity was made to be a state religion, okay, priests, bishops, and leaders of the church, became powerful, became wealthy, you know, became highly privileged to the extent that they were living their lives apparently too far away from how Jesus lived his life. And so some, at least among the Christian monasticism, Christian monasticism, basically it was coming from an original intuition that asked the question, are we still really Christians? How come the life we live is very different from that type of life that Christ lived in his life? And so some of them, in their attempt to be able to understand the radical uh, meaning and the radical identity of being Christians, decided to abandon a kind of life that was not reflective of the kind of life of Christ. So they went to the desert, they went to the caves, they went to isolation and live life of asceticism and frugality in a way embracing the suffering that Jesus himself embraced in his life. Do you understand? So here, monasticism, okay, uh, began to spread in the many different parts of the known world during that time, especially when Christianity was already, in a way, dominant in the whole empire. Okay, so during this whole period, okay, in the Roman Empire and beyond that, especially the whole Roman Empire, we said we see the spread of the monastic movement. It is a movement where people actually tried to seek out Christian perfection. It was not enough for them just to be able to live a Christian life. There were no more persecutions. Okay, there were a lot of temptations to live a very lax life, a Christian life, etc. And but there were some who took seriously their Christian life and wanted to live their life, seeking out Christian perfection or perfection in Christian charity. They gave, offered their lives in monastic communities, okay, to live a more radical life of following Jesus. Okay, during this period, okay, what became important influence in the development of moral theology was the introduction of auricular confession. Okay, what do you mean by auricular confession? That confession is done through personal confession of sin. Do you understand? Personal confession of sin. Okay, if I committed something in my own thoughts, I had an impulse to consider that already sin. Because before, the experience of the sacrament of reconciliation, of course, it was not defined yet, because the definition of the seven sacraments only happened during the Council of Trent. Okay, that we have to put that in historical perspective. But there were already practices among Christians on how to live their lives, especially the cultic dimension of their lives. And the practice of reconciliation was already done among early Christian communities. How did they do that? When you commit three kinds of sins only, okay, that you are to do that publicly, admit that, and ask pardon from the community for having committed any of these three sins that you need to confess in public, and that you would be always also welcome back to the public, but you can only do that once. Okay? That was the exercise in the early Christian communities. And what are those sins? Murder, adultery, okay, apostasy. When you, for example, as a Christian, in a way abandoned your faith in exchange for something, out of fear or out of privilege, you commit apostasy and you disentangle yourself from the Christian communities, and therefore you get excommunicated in that way. Okay? When you commit adultery, you also are able to do that because you are not following the mores of the community. So you, in a way, isolate yourself from what the community should is called to live out. When you, for example, murder somebody, okay, you also cut off yourself from the community. For you to be able to go back to the community, you need to admit that you have committed the sins publicly, and that before the whole community and with the presence of the bishop or his representative, you get admitted back to the church. Do you understand? That was how reconciliation, the sacrament of penance or reconciliation was done. Okay. But you see, many Christians were not murdering other people. Many Christians were not actually committing adultery. Many Christians were not really doing apostasy. But there were moments in their lives when, for example, I look at a woman lustfully, okay, and I had impure thoughts. Okay, one, somebody confessed to the priest in our regular confession, Father, I had impure thoughts. And the priest asked him, did you entertain them? And then the penitent said, no, Father, I did not entertain them, but they entertained me. Okay. So once you get entertained by that, whoever, whichever is the case, you actually have to admit that you have, in a way, allowed yourself in your own vulnerability and frailty. You have to be able to admit that and ask for pardon for whatever sin that you have committed. Okay? And so you did not, so you don't have to do public penance because you did not actually, uh, committed adultery, but you had it only in the thoughts. But, you know, Christians who were taking seriously the words of Jesus, who said in the gospel, okay, if you have lustful thoughts about a woman, you already commit adultery. Okay? And therefore, they want to seek out Christian perfection because those were the words of Jesus. And therefore, I am not satisfied with having to go to confession only when I actually abandoned my wife and actually went with another woman or vice versa. So, some people and monks especially try to do that. And later on, that practice in the monastery is spread in many different parts because people also who were lay people also took that seriously and they were influenced by the monks. And the monks were preaching to them, you confess your sins to God and etc. to his instrument and all that. And so many went. So there was a time when in some regions this was not practiced, but in many regions it was practiced in such a way that later on this became the dominant practice. And during the time of Trent, when the seven sacraments were actually defined by the church, it became, the auricular confession was the form that was actually admitted as the sacrament of penance. Do you understand? Now, what happened? When people, okay, particularly in monasteries, you would have only a priests who will serve as confessor of the rest of the community. Most of them are brothers. They they actually had many different concerns, but they never had formal education, isn't it? Some of them, because you are the holiest of the community, they appoint you to become priest, and the bishop ordains you, and so that people go to you for confessions. Do you understand? But you never had any knowledge of what are sins, or what type of penance should I give, etc. And so as a result, okay, because it could happen like people begin to talk about venial sins, mortal sins, then they talk about heavy sins. No? Father, I stole uh, rope. Oh, that's not serious. Okay, but at the end of the rope is a carabao, Father. So that becomes serious. So it changes altogether the whole scenario. So uh, therefore, it is important to weigh, and the concern of those who were practicing it was basically whether they're giving the right type of penance or penalty, or uh, what is this? Yeah, the penance that you give. And so that people and monks, particularly confessors, could be guided during this time, what came out were the penitentiary books. Okay, what do you mean by penitentiary books? Okay, penitentiary books actually were guide for priests who had low level of clerical education. Okay, these were lists of sins with their corresponding penances. For example, uh, you commit, uh, you commit impure thoughts. What is your equivalent penance? So they come up with something like that, so that you're just. There was one monk, uh, who confessor in another monastery, who uh, confessed to another monastery, and when the first monk confessed his sins, the the other confessor, the other monastery gave him a penance, and you know what the penance was? He said, "Okay, what you do is, okay, pray the stations of the cross, and in every station you recite the rosary." Wow, that's really serious penance. Okay, and then when the other one confessed his sins to the other confessor, the 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 penance that he received, okay, Father, okay, you can recite the rosary, and for every Hail Mary, you make a station of the cross. Wow, that's more difficult. So yeah, so yeah, it depends. Therefore, on what kind of So just to prevent such from happening, there should be certain guides that people should do. Okay, but what are the implications of this in doing, in thinking about what is good and what is bad? There were serious implications. Okay, we'll see. Okay, during this time, moral theology, which early on was identified with prudential or phronetic thinking, based from the preaching of the fathers of the church, this period gave way to identification of moral theology with the sacrament of penance, and with priests, because everything had to rely especially on the priest confessors. Do you understand? Especially narrowed to the appreciation of sin, justice, from the perspective of the penitential books. Do you understand? So people who were seeking perfection at the beginning in Christian charity ended up getting so focused on what sins, you know, serious sin or venial sin, to avoid, became very mathematical. And this resulted, okay, to the association of moral theology also with Christian minimalism. Okay? So it's okay. That's only a venial sin. As long as you don't commit mortal sin, it's okay. Okay. So that becomes very problematic. So it was just a question of avoiding mortal sins. And then the emphasis was on justice over compassion and mercy. Okay, because the penitentiary books would always guide the priest to exercise justice to the penitents, and therefore that became the focus. So the retribution for sins was the focus. What they give is the penance I'm going to give just or not, etc. But it was not anymore about, okay, the loving mercy and compassion of God. You know, I don't know, it's not breaking the seal of confession if I tell you that it is so nice when I hear people, especially sisters, when they go to confession, they would not right away go to the enumeration of the sins that they committed, but they would always first ground themselves with the idea that God is a loving God. God has been so kind to me, Father, and yet, in spite of his love for me, I still offended him in the following ways. One, two. You see, the context is always within that relationship, loving relationship between God. It is not focused merely on the law that they break, okay, but in the relationship that they had with God. So there were implications. Therefore, moral theology, okay, became minimalist and became focused on the individual acts. Okay, it became act oriented. Do you remember what happened with Judaism? Okay, what happened to the Old Testament moral law that God gave to Moses initially was in within the framework of love, the matrix of loving relationship and the covenantal relationship between God and his people. And eventually, through the interpretation of the scribes and Pharisees, they became actually just oriented to individual acts, okay, minimalism, okay, it's oriented to the law. Do you understand? The very things that Jesus himself somehow wanted to transform, okay? That is the reason why we talked about Jesus, in a way, introducing a new ethics of love, ethics of compassion, ethics of interiority, ethics of perfection, okay? Ethics of the human person. Is that clear? So, what happened during this period, unfortunately, at least with the majority, was, identifying moral theology with the priest who had to make decisions on what was right and what penance was due to particular sins that were committed. Okay, let's move on. Okay. In the 11th to 13th centuries, these were very important landmarks too. What happened during these centuries was the development and growth of uh, rational theology. Remember, before it was sapiential, prudential, and phronetic theology based on the wisdom, okay, drawn from the experience of faith. So very fiducial now. But this time, it was during the period when thinking, rationality became the dominant framework and methodology that was interested in understanding, okay, our faith and in understanding the demands of our faith in our life. And so it was the period of the Summa Theologica. Okay, it was the period of the great synthesis in theology and morality that were put together: dogma, spirituality, etc. They were put together under one particular school of thought. Okay, so here you can speak of a shift, okay, from having a having given rise to the great universities, European universities, like for example in Bologna, Italy. Okay, you talk about Oxford, you talk about uh, uh, other universities, okay, in Europe, which became the center of learning. Okay, Louvain came much later in the 15th century. Okay, but uh, already, along this fundamental direction of developing theology in a most rational way. Okay, early on, before the 11th century, you know that the center of learning were the monasteries, monastic schools, and the cathedral canons. The cathedral canons normally were based on big uh, centers of faith, like cathedral. Like for example, in Paris, you have, for example, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which was the center of learning. You had great preachers, okay, of high learning who actually would elaborate already in a most systematic way thoughts about our faith, our mores, and also our own belief in God. One example of that was, have you heard about uh, Peter Abelard? Peter Abelard in philosophy is a great philosopher, but he had gone through a very profound experience of his humanity and his vulnerability. Uh, uh, there is a film, if you're interested to watch, okay, the title of the film, you write it down. The title of the film is Stealing Heaven, okay? This is the story of Peter Abelard and eventually the girlfriend that he had, Eloise, okay, in Paris. Okay, Peter Abelard was a great philosopher, and he never married precisely because he knew, especially at the beginning, that philosophers should never be distracted from any carnal desires, and that therefore they have only to allow themselves to be taken up by profound thinking and rationality, the pursuit of the truth of the one and the beautiful. Okay, so philosophers during the time never married, and Peter Abelard never got married until he saw this young, beautiful, so attractive woman, and he actually fell for her, and he actually had sexual relationship with her. Okay, and I brought that film when I was teaching in Mindanao, and I forgot that there are sensitive parts in the film, like actual with frontal nudity, actual sexual encounters, okay, between Peter Abelard and Eloise, okay. And when we watched that, I forgot about that, and so I showed that film to the OND sisters in Cotabato during the summer program there. And when that part came, and it lasted for about, I think, 2 minutes or 3 minutes, I was so embarrassed. Oh my God, I forgot that there is something like that in the film. And but after the film, I apologized from the sisters. Sisters, sorry, I did not. I forgot that there is something sensitive. I did not forewarn. And then the sisters told me, "It's okay, Father." Okay, they're all mature. Okay, so if you want to watch that, that gives a very good example of how universities, or rather, there were no universities yet, how the cathedrals became the centers of learning. He became very, very famous. But of course, some punished him for that offense that he committed. He got castrated, and eventually he abandoned Eloise and became a monk and became a founder of a monastic community. And Eloise also went to the monastery. But it's curious. You watch it at the end. Okay. Now, so here there was a shift from wisdom theology to rational theology. Theology began to be considered a science because of its logic. Okay, it became very logical, philosophical, and systematic exposition. Okay, and during this period in particular, there were great summaries of knowledge of faith. Okay, and the ones we actually could remember during this period were the great thinkers like from the Franciscan Bonaventure, okay, who continued uh, the framework of doing theology, particularly moral theology, from the Platonic tradition. Okay, you have to remember that Augustine and also the Franciscans eventually followed that had greater emphasis on the will, okay, and practical intellect more than theoretical theological knowledge, okay, in order to achieve holiness. So, following Augustine, it was more important to have the will that surrenders itself to faith, okay? That is the most important thing. What I desire is God. And from my own experience of my own faith in God, okay, that leads me to a practical understanding of what God wants me to understand. Credo ut intelligam. So the whole question of divine illumination, okay, to to which Augustine in a way dwelt on, became the typology in doing moral theology for this group of Franciscans. By the way, Bonaventure actually, uh, I think, was still alive. Saint Francis, who died in 1225 or 26, uh, says Bonaventure already heard as a very, very young man uh, about Saint Saint Francis of Assisi, and he joined the orders. He was one of the most intelligent, and he, in fact, he was commissioned by the orders to write the first biography of Saint Francis of Assisi, the little flower of Assisi. Okay, and of course, on the other hand, the Dominicans had Thomas Aquinas, okay, who also died in 1274. But he actually adopted the Aristotelian tradition. Already we made mention about that. Okay, there was the centrality of contemplation of pure truth through science of reason. So the greater emphasis is given to rationality over because the other one is more voluntarism. Okay, not voluntarism, voluntary, ay, voluntarism, not volunteerism. No, voluntarism is more focused on the will, but at Thomas Aquinas, yes, the Dominicans actually got more focus on the science of rationality, and of course that was the time when post-liberals would refer to Thomas Aquinas as having started onto theology. That's a technical term, onto theology, when theology had to be focused on the understanding of being, onto, di ba? Ontology, and theology got associated with being. You remember the Cinque Vie of Thomas Aquinas, isn't it? Okay? The reason, contingency of being, etc. Di ba? Yung unmoved mover, etc. All of those were all discussions on the being of God. Okay? So identifying theology, we're trying to focus on what is this being and all, etc. Kaya nga, onto theology. Okay. Of course, this is, I'm not going to expound too much on that because we don't have enough time. Okay. Now, ethical discussions were incorporated in the overall synthesis of Christian theology. There was a very profound connection between dogmatics and ethics, faith and action, grace and nature, and then you talk about a very holistic theology. That's why you can identify already schools of thought, okay, very, very clearly in the way theology was done methodologically. Okay, let's move on. And the fourth and sixth century,